I'm Wendy from TechFest. We'd like to welcome you very much to Scotland's Digital Science Festival on its final evening, and this amazing presentation that we have from John this evening, who's come along to help us. So a very intelligent man with not one, not two, but 3 PhDs and 7 university degrees. But your talents do go beyond the academical. I did find your YouTube site and some of the information that was on there. So public speaker, author, musician, cartoonist. You have awards for your haiku, which is incredible. Your own YouTube channel, as I've said, and then the one that is most intriguing that I will grill you about later is you've also had to go up being a bricklayer. So obviously, John isn't here to talk to you about bricklaying this evening, but he is here to talk to you and share his expertise on AI. So John has been a consultant in Silicon Valley and has worked for problem solving for some amazing companies such as Google, Facebook, and LinkedIn. But they haven't come here tonight, John, to listen to me. So with much ado, I will hand over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Wendy. I appreciate it. I hope you all can hear me and see me all right. I'm not sure if this microphone makes my Scottish accent disappear. I probably sound Canadian or something. I'm going to share my screen now and start a presentation that will actually begin with a self-introduction, because I wasn't aware of how well Wendy would do that. So let me see. Oh my gosh, I'm getting all kinds of interesting after effects of the screen sharing, but we'll see how it goes. I hope you can all see the screen I want you to see. Yes? Okay, let's see what happens. Can you all see my name there? Grand. All right. So my name is John, and I hope you will all call me John. But in print and in publications, I call myself with my middle initials, John N.A. Brown, just to make it clear that I'm not just N.A. John Brown, because there are thousands of us who work in the different fields that I work in. And the confusion has cost me some things in the past. So I like to try to avoid that. Anyway, that's a quick bit. My name, again, please call me John. As Wendy mentioned, I've worked for a few companies you might have heard of, maybe a few you haven't, tiny little startups, some of them in Europe, some of them around the world, some of them back in Canada, and some of the bigger ones during the nearly 8 years I spent in Silicon Valley. So a lot of corporate work, a lot of corporate research specifically into how humans and machines interact. But I also work in academia. So this is a small sample of some of the papers I've written in several different fields. As Wendy mentioned, I like to play around in a number of different fields. And at the bottom are some of the books that I've either written or contributed to, including the Bloomsbury Encyclopedia of Design from here in the UK. I think I've got 8 different articles that I wrote in that. And incidentally, that's one of the places where accidentally they called me just John Brown. And it was quite a hilarious outcome. I sent out a number of emails during the long process of accepting the invitation and writing articles for them, saying, please, John N.A., N.A., please, John N.A. And in the end, they were horribly apologetic, but I don't think realized the scope of the problem until they got a thank you from a designer living in London whose name is John Brown, who thanked them for the publicity of having suddenly been credited with 8 articles in their encyclopedia. Anyhow, so there's that. There's Mathematics and Society, which was fun. And then the other 3 are books with Springer, the big scientific publisher. The one in the middle is my first ever book. Anthropology-based computing is the field of computing that I invented. A way of looking at computers and other technology based on the simple abilities and limitations of human beings, the way our minds work, the way that our bodies work, and using that as sort of a system for figuring out what should and shouldn't be done with machines and their control systems. Next to that is Hunting the Snark, a book about a smart home project I worked on with 2 great scientists, Anton Ferrier and Gerhard Leitner, who was leading the project. It was a project to introduce smart home technology into farmhouses and countryside houses occupied by senior citizens, so they could get the advantages of a smart home without having to learn how to use computers. And the last one might be the most fun, Set Phasers to Teach. It was co-edited by myself, Stefan Rabic, who originally led the project, Martin Gabriel, and Wilfried Elmenreich, who are all in Austria. Set Phasers to Teach is a collection of essays from people in many different fields, I think 15 different fields across Europe and North America, talking about how Star Trek influenced their work. So it's quite fun. Things from medical diagnostics to anthropology and history. It's quite a fun collection. Oh, and engineering and video games. Anyway, a nice read. So that's a little bit of my history, but let's talk about what we're going to talk about tonight. Yeah, I did put some titles after my name there. I left most of them out. I hope you don't mind. But yeah, don't worry about all that crap. Remember, the name is John, and tonight we're going to talk about how AI controls your behavior and why it works. And the first bit, AI, IQ, LOL, is because AI doesn't have an IQ. It just doesn't. The AIs that we're using now just don't have IQs. And that's a controversial topic, and I'm happy to have controversy. If you have questions or comments about it, I look forward to discussing it with you at the end of the talk. Make a point of leaving some time for that. But I'm going to go through and talk about how AI controls your behavior right now and why it works, why it manages to do that. Not just one or two people who are listening to this now, not just weak-minded presidents of the United States, but all of us are being manipulated by AI right now, today, as I talk to you. And I want to explain how and why that happens so that you can decide whether to do something about it. And if so, maybe I can even help you figure out what you should do about it. Now, before we start, I want to introduce a concept that maybe some of you already know, which is the Dunning-Kruger effect. I don't know if you're already familiar with the Dunning-Kruger effect. It gets a lot of press coverage. It gets a lot of mention on people's blogs and things like that. Basically, what Dunning and Kruger did, if you'll follow that blue line, the upwards axis is how much confidence you have, and the sideways axis is how much experience you have. So if you start from knowing absolutely nothing about something, can you see my cursor? Thank you. So if you start from here and you know absolutely nothing about something, and then somebody says, do you know that they surf on snow? It's called snowboarding. And the first thing you think is, well, I could probably do that. So with no experience at all, you immediately get some confidence together. Because how hard could it be? If other people do it, I could probably do it. And then you try and land on your head. And immediately your confidence disappears. And you have to start again. And slowly with experience, you can build up confidence again. So as you get really good, once you get really good at something, then your confidence becomes less. You start thinking, boy, there's probably expert levels I could go to that I don't know about. Once you get good at something, once you have a lot of experience with it. But to start on any skill, humans just have this tendency, when you first hear about something and know very little about it, you have this tendency to think, how much could there be to know? Maybe everything I've heard is most of what there is to know. Maybe there isn't a lot more to know. And that's just how we are, especially when we're dealing with psychogenesis, which is a term that Jean Piaget used to use, a fellow from Switzerland a long time ago, who is considered one of the greatest experts in how humans learn. Psychogenesis just means you come up with the ideas yourself. Okay, so when you're coming up with ideas yourself, when you're learning things on your own, it's extremely common. It's almost universal to go through these periods of illusory superiority when you think this is going to be no problem at all. I already know just about everything there is to know. Right? And that's what we all do. Believe me, I've been through it many times. I've felt that superiority and I've crashed to the ground afterwards. The thing is, this happens. It's a natural thing with humans. And another cool thing happens. You can skip that part of the false confidence and the false superiority, and you can skip the crash to the ground if you start from the position that, this is new to me and I probably don't know as much as there is to know. If you start with humility, then you can grow into learning over experience, learning from your experiences. And it's easier for you to do. And it doesn't have that emotional upset of crashing to the ground. That emotional upset of crashing to the ground is why a lot of people give up. I don't know how many of you out there rode a bike successfully the first time you tried, but I can tell you I didn't. And when I was learning how to ride a bike, I failed a lot and I got very frustrated. And there were times when I thought, nope, that's just not going to happen. Same thing with tying my shoes. When I learned to tie my shoes, I gave up a whole bunch of times. I remember it well because it was last week. Anyway, let's carry on. All of us feel that we know something about AI. All of us feel that now. It's been in the press a lot. People have been talking about it, especially when you think AI means something like ChatGPT. We know so much about it right now. But what I want to suggest to you is that if you have a lot of confidence in the area, maybe it's that feeling of superiority that you shouldn't really have. And I'm speaking from a personal vantage point here. I've been trying to redesign the way AIs are fundamentally structured for about 8 years with a brilliant researcher who's currently in Aarhus, Denmark, Lucas Esterle. He and I have been working together for just about 8 years now, trying to figure out how to do that, how to make AIs more self-reflective and a little bit more like human beings in terms of being able to accept information from others, to practice this sociogenesis that stops us from having to learn with accidents at the beginning, this learning from others. So that's something I've been working on for a long time. I worked with the brilliant Stephen Tartakovsky in California before I came here a year and a bit ago on trying to understand how ChatGPT actually works and how it thinks. So we did a series of experiments with ChatGPT. So I have some actual experience with AIs, especially theoretical AIs as they might be applied to cyber-physical systems like the Mars rover, which is what Lucas and I were working on, not the Mars rover, but cyber-physical systems in general. Um, and also with ChatGPT, as I said, working with Stephen. So I have some experience, and I can tell you, I know almost nothing about AI, almost nothing at all. For example, I didn't know just when it was that AIs made big news, right? All of a sudden, people were talking about them for the first time. These are headlines. The first one is a headline from the New York Times um, about artificial neural networks or AI. And the next one is from the New Yorker. That's why it starts with Indeed, because it's a little pretentious, like the New Yorker. Very good writers there, and they know it. So these are a couple of headlines that you, I don't know how many of you remember when artificial neural networks, or AI as they were calling it already, came into the public eye, but that was 1958. So maybe it's been around a lot longer than what you realize. Maybe that's what's happened. Maybe it's possible that there are things you don't know about AI that date back a long time ago. So before we get into anything else, I want to talk about that a little bit, about the history of AI or artificial neural networks or large language models, and basically the version of them that we consider AI now, this thing like ChatGPT. It all started with the idea that you could model uh, mathematical structures or computer programming eventually uh, to work like the neurons inside a human or an animal. And that idea was around since the 1930s. There's some debate about who actually built the first one. The person who I tend to credit with it is this chap here, whose name is Rosenblatt. That's the chap who was being referred to in the newspaper headline that I showed you, in the magazine quote I showed you. Sam Rosenblatt had come up with this thing he called a perceptron, and it was based on the way that human nerves communicate. And he ran it as a series of uh, uh, programs inside this nice big room-filling IBM 704 computer. So for those of you who aren't familiar with what computers used to look like before you wore them on your wrist or in your pacemaker or carried them around in your pocket, this is what we used to call a computer. Before this, computers were people, mostly women, who did mathematics really well. But mechanical computers or electronic computers, this is it. And so he built the perceptron. And what it could do was, if you held a card up to its camera, it could decide whether the card had a mark on its left side or its right side. That's what it could do. So this whole thing about being able to recognize its environment and learn from experience and teach itself to think, just like, nah, that was hype. That was press. It had the possibility to grow into that. It certainly did. And Rosenblatt himself talked about it that way. He said it's the first machine capable of having an original idea. And I'm not sure it was. But that's the kind of thing we hear about now with AI. So let's talk a bit about what happened to his perceptron and how we ended up with ChatGPT. This was, as I said, this was 1958 that those headlines came out. He had gotten his PhD about 2 years earlier. 1958, this headline comes out. 1959, he's head of, well, he was a psychologist, by the way. There weren't very many computer scientists in those days. He was a psychologist, like a lot of the people, psychologists and mathematicians who were trying to model how humans think, and maybe machines could think the same way. So within a couple of years, he was heading up a research institute, and people went mad for it. Right? He got so much funding. He got so much publicity. He was the most famous scientist in North America for a while. And then about 10 years later, these two guys, Minsky and Papert, published a book called Perceptrons, not Perceptron, what he called his machine, but perceptrons, as though they could talk about them in general. And Minsky was actually one of the people who had built what some people say is an earlier version of an artificial neural network a few years before Rosenblatt. But they were at a competing university, and you know how those academics are. They like to diss each other's work. And that's what they did. And they wrote this book basically making the argument that you see up at the top there, which means nothing to you if you're not a certain kind of mathematician. But XOR, sorry, we all love our jargon. What that statement says is that if you have two positive inputs, right? We know that two positive inputs, a yes from one channel and a yes from another channel. Are we gonna have dinner tonight? Everybody says yes. Well, that means yes, right? So just think of it that way. The AB arrows you see here are two positive inputs coming in. Okay, and so a person can consider A and B together, right? And so if A is yes and B is no, you can consider those together and say, okay, we've got no decision here, right? And that's what you see here. Both of them say zero, that means zero. Both of them say no, that means no. Both of them say yes. Wait a minute, that's not what we do. But that was a problem with perceptrons. They couldn't figure out that no plus no means no, yes plus no means yes, no plus yes means yes, and yes plus yes should also mean yes. Perceptrons couldn't do that. So that was one of the arguments that they made about perceptrons. And you can see how happy they are about making the argument there in the photo. Basically, what they were saying was this isn't really an artificial neural network that thinks like humans. It's only a couple of layers deep. It's made of these giant machines, because in those days you had to have vacuum tubes to power a computer. There weren't such thing as microchips yet. They said if you tried to make one that was as complex as the human brain, there isn't enough electrical equipment in the world. And it would be gigantic. It would have to be the size of a planet. Like, it's just silly. It's pointless. Stop doing it. It can't think the way we do anyway. And they convinced everyone. Not because their arguments were so great, but just it was a change in the tide. It had been 10 years. And all of a sudden, Rosenblatt, most famous scientist there is, tons and tons of funding, great big dedicated lab, lots of people traveling the world to work with him, lost everything. Lost everything. On his 42nd birthday, he went out sailing in the 70s and didn't make it home. Little sad story. This is not him. This is somebody else. This is a physicist who came up with a really cool idea, purely in physics. And he found that there are materials that defied statistical probability in the way that they behave, but they did it in a way that was predictable. And that has nothing to do with AI, so never mind. I just thought I'd mention him because I like mentioning people. His name is John Hopfield. That's all. I certainly won't refer to him again in a couple of minutes. That would be ridiculous. Anyway, that's John Hopfield, a physicist who came up with a cool idea that struck the interest of a few people. Modern AI is based on the work of these three people, psychologists and computer scientists, Jan LeCun, Joshua Bengio, and Geoffrey Hinton, who got together at the University of Toronto back in the 80s and 90s and did some really cool work together. They did some cool work together that led to the rebirth of the idea of artificial neural networks. That book, Perceptrons, and the criticism of the perceptron idea had been so strong that what's been called AI winter took hold, and people stopped working on AI based on artificial neural networks, just stopped altogether. And the field went dead for more than a decade. And then these guys came along and said, you know what? We can do this. And this photo of, or these photos of the three of them are from when they won the Turing Award in 2018. The Association of Computing Machinery, or ACM, gives out an annual award that's considered to be the Nobel Prize in Computing. And these three guys won it together for having made these huge advancements in artificial intelligence based on artificial neural networks that is the fundamental basis of all of the AIs that people talk about now. In fact, these guys went on to careers at companies that I won't name because I don't want to give them any more promotion than I already have. They don't need it. But just to be clear, not all of them stayed at those companies once they started producing AIs. Anyway, that's something for you to look up and find out more about on your own, and then we can talk about it the next time we see each other. So these guys picked up on the artificial neural networks idea from Rosenblatt. And it being a decade or so later, they managed to have great success with it and change the way the world does computing. Enough so that they won the Turing Award. Cool, right? Well, this past summer, it was announced that Geoffrey Hinton, who headed up that group of three, won the Nobel Prize in Physics. Because you remember that physicist I mentioned, Hopfield? Well, he's the guy who came up with this weird physics property that no one had noticed or measured or figured out how to use before. That was the basis of the work that Hinton did that caused a rebirth of artificial neural networks. It made it possible to start predicting with some accuracy the probabilities of things happening and getting a sort of a predictive learning matter, a predictive learning algorithm, a way of predicting forward what might happen based on previous experience. And that's the basis of large language models, and that's the basis of ChatGPT. So these guys got the Nobel Prize in Physics together for how they used this physics breakthrough. Pretty nifty, huh? Now, what does that mean for us? Where are we now that these things have happened and these physics properties have been measured and some clever psychologists have decided to make computers that will someday be able to think better than humans and take over the world, right? I hope you know at least one of these symbols. Depending on how old you are, maybe you know both of them or how much of a nerd you are. If you're a nerd like me, you know both of them and can talk at great length about them. I'll try not to. Skynet, of course, Cyberdyne Systems Corporation. This is the company from the Terminator movies that launches Skynet, and it's the AI that takes over the world and decides to kill all humans. HAL 9000, purely coincidental, I'm told, that HAL is just one letter off from IBM, purely coincidental. HAL 9000 is the computer on board a spaceship that decides the humans on board the spaceship are jeopardizing the mission and should be killed off in the movie 2001, A Space Odyssey. So that's where we're at, right? AIs have been created and everyone knows that's what's coming next. They're going to take over the world and kill us all, or they're going to kick us out of the spaceship and kill us that way, right? We all know that, right? On that happy note, let's take a break for just a moment. We're halfway through my talk. We're nearly to question time. So I'll just take a deep breath and remember that not the whole world cares about AI. There are plants and trees that hardly are even aware that Facebook exists, much less AI. Nice deep breath. And now that everyone's started to relax and not be so worried, let's move forward and let's talk about our best friends. Our best friends, yours and mine. Our best friends that we carry around in our pocket. And we trust them implicitly because they're our best friends. No one is closer to you. You're, you're not sure your phone is your best friend? Oh, there's a simple test. It's a really simple test. If you're talking with someone and somebody interrupts you, you either decide to let them interrupt you or not, right? Sometimes you say, oh, hang on just a second, we're in the middle of a conversation. Sometimes you say it with less politeness. Sometimes you say it with more, right? Sweetie, we're talking right now. Just wait a moment if you can, right? Or do you mind? We're having a conversation. There's lots of ways you can say it, but you all know, I think, what I'm talking about. When somebody interrupts you in the middle of a conversation, you continue the conversation unless the person interrupting is more important. How many people out in the audience there, and you don't have to wave your hands, I won't be able to see them. How many people out in the audience there have ever been interrupted in a conversation by their phone? The phone rings, you stop your conversation and answer the phone. The phone buzzes, you stop your conversation and look to see what's buzzing. Is it an important alert? Is it an influencer you really care about posting new photos? Is that what's going on? Is your house on fire? What is it? It could be anything. Goodness knows you have to stop doing what you're doing. That's why surgeons aren't allowed to bring their phones into the surgery theater. That's why for many years, the number one cause of death for people between the age of 16 and 25 around the world was distracted driving because of smartphones, as published by the United Nations. Our smartphones can interrupt us no matter what we're doing. So obviously they're our best friends. They are the most important thing there is. You care about their interruption more than you care about anything else. And if you really think that's not the case for you, please remember the Dunning-Kruger curve that we looked at. It's possible that you're right. It's possible that you are the one person in a billion who can resist the siren call of their phone. But it's not likely. It's more likely that you're kidding yourself. Why is that? Well, that's because our phones are designed in such a way, and the apps on them are designed even more so, to stimulate two chemical reactions, two simple biochemical reactions inside our brain. One of them is the release of endorphin, which means endogenically or internally generated morphine, right? So that's a chemical that gets released in the middle of your brain that makes you feel less pain and more joy. And when you're playing a video game and you're playing and you're doing well, that's what's going on. Endorphins are being released. When you're scrolling on your phone and you're scrolling through whatever app it is you scroll through, you're scrolling along and you're doing it quite unconsciously and you see something that you like and you pause for it, endorphin floods through your brain, just as though you'd had some great moment in your life, being kissed by someone you love, eating a truly delicious food. You're getting the same stimulation from scrolling. The phone is triggering this in your brain. When you stop scrolling because somebody says, stop that now, stop that and pay attention to this lecture. We're all listening to this lecture, for goodness sake. Stop looking at your phone and just pay attention for a little while. Maybe he'll say something interesting. When somebody says that to you and you put your phone down and you start feeling that fear of missing out, that FOMO, that's cortisol. That's cortisol being released in your brain and causing you to feel uneasiness and maybe even fear. And it's happening because the apps have been designed to trigger that. I hope that makes sense to you. And we can talk about it more later if you want, but I want to move on because it's not just apps that have been designed to trigger that. A lot of stuff in our lives have been designed to trigger that now. A professor in the Midwestern United States figured out how to do that and taught a bunch of people how to do that a couple of decades ago. And because of that, a lot of stuff we are involved with now, machines, apps, other things, a lot of stuff is designed in what they call gamification. It's designed to make it feel like a game, but not every part of the game, not the social aspects of the game. It's that I am succeeding in getting better that causes one chemical or a group of chemicals to be released, or that, oh, no, I can't stop, that causes other chemicals to be released. And it's manipulating us all the time. And it was bad enough when a game was designed to do that once. But when a game is designed to include a large language model in it or an AI in it that's reading your responses and responding to them, recustomizing things based on the goal with which it was programmed, then it's adapting to everything you do. For example, that nice smiley happy phone that lets you scroll through Instagram or Facebook or TikTok. When you're scrolling through there, do you ever click on an ad you really aren't interested in? Of course not. Nobody's going to click on an ad they're not interested in unless they have shaky hands like me and do it by accident. You might pause for a second to see if you're interested in it. And when you pause, the algorithm knows. Algorithm is just a fancy word for something that does a bunch of the same steps over and over again. When you brush your teeth every morning and night, which of course we all do, you're following an algorithm for which teeth you start with and go to next and end with. When you tie your shoelaces, it's an algorithm. You don't have to think about it. You had to think about it when you were learning. Now you don't think about it anymore. The behavior is algorithmic. So these softwares, we can say that they're algorithmic too. So they recognize that you paused. And what happens if you pause for a moment and then start scrolling again? If you have the phone of a friend in your hand, or your parents maybe who are watching a lecture with you right now and had forgotten that you're holding their phone, scroll through their Instagram and pause at an ad they would hate. Just pause there for a moment. And what happens? When you start scrolling again in a moment, after a second or 3 or 10, that ad will come up again. Because the people who designed the algorithm is all based not on giving you comfort, but on getting you to pay attention to ads so that they get paid for it. You are not the customer of Reddit. You are not the customer of any of these apps. You are the money source. You are the thing they are selling. Your attention is what they are selling to the advertisers who pay them. So if you pause for just a moment, the algorithm says, ah, she was interested, but not interested enough to click, so we should show it again. Then she'll be interested enough to click. When it comes up again on your family's phone or your friend's phone, pause again, and then keep scrolling. They'll have that ad popping up on a regular basis for a long time. Ha 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 ha. Oh, sorry. That would be horrible. Don't do that. Now, there's another thing about these biochemical triggers that we're getting, the fear of missing out chemicals and this feels really good chemicals. Increasingly, we live in a society where we're surrounded by really complicated machines. And the more complicated a machine is, as you know, or a process is, the more frustrating it is. And the more frustrating it is, the more the people who are making it are going to try to gamify it. So pretty soon you've got obstacles that are completely unnecessary. And they're trying to get around them by making the whole thing interesting enough that you'll ignore the obstacles and keep trying. That's a pattern of reward called intermittent reward by the psychologists. That's exactly how you train people to do things. If you want to train people really efficiently, don't reward them every time they get something right. Reward them most of the time and keep them guessing about whether this time they'll get rewarded or not. That won't work on most primates, but it will work on humans. And don't punish them every time they get something wrong. Punish them badly, like with fear of missing out chemicals seeping through their brain. But let them keep guessing about will it happen this time or not. And their fear and their hopes train them stronger, more strongly than actual punishment or reward. I'm going to talk to you for just a moment about something called learned helplessness, because that's what results if this becomes too frustrating and you decide you can't go on. Remember that Dunning-Kruger curve. If you hit the bottom and it's just not worth trying to get up and start again, right? You've tried to play the game. This game is too hard. I'm just not going to keep going. An AI algorithm will realize that was too hard for you and make it easier before you quit in order to keep you playing. The game on its own won't do that. But if you do quit, if you do decide that's it, I'm done, what's happened to you? Well, some psychologists who were trying to study something else found out about it a little while ago. And I'm going to tell you about a horrible experiment that hurt some dogs in a really horrible way. So please don't report me to the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Dogs who died decades ago. As I say, they died decades ago. I don't know if there is such a society, but I'm not someone who likes cruelty to dogs. I never did these experiments. In fact, I'm going to illustrate this story with a picture of me with my favorite dog. That's Dirk, my family's dog out in Newfoundland. And that's me and Dirk a couple of months ago. So yeah, I like dogs. This is not a story about me hurting dogs. This is a story about some horrible, horrible people who decided in the 1960s that they could hurt some dogs in order to learn something about how animals learn. So what they did was they built this little room with a little low wall in it. So it's basically two rooms separated by a really low wall. And they'd put a dog on one side of that low wall. And the floors had some mesh in it that could be electrified. So their idea was, we'll shoot some electricity through the floor, and the dog will learn to get over the wall and be on the floor that isn't being electrified. And if we give them more inconsistent, more regular, more quick, stronger electric shocks, they'll learn to go faster. And eventually, as soon as you put them on this floor, they'll hop over to the other floor. Right? That's what they were expecting, having studied the work of people who did that kind of operant conditioning based on the theories of a chap named B.F. Skinner. That's what they were expecting, but what happened was horrible. They shock the dog gets uncomfortable and tries to get out of there, and some of them figure out, go over the wall, and they're okay. But if the shocks keep coming before the dog can figure out what to do, the dog lays down on the floor and takes it. Just accepts they can't make a difference. And they lay down on the floor and accept that their fate is to be shocked. That sounds horrible. It might feel even worse to you if you consider all of the people you know who don't bother voting in elections because it doesn't make a difference. They are having the same experience as those shocked dogs. They are having the experience of deciding that there's nothing they can do about something they could do something about. They have been convinced to give up. And it's not just elections. Do you have any media subscriptions, maybe to a streaming service, that you don't have time to watch? And you're still paying for it every month? Because you just, it's so much trouble to discontinue it. It's ridiculous to think about it, but we all have that. We all have that with so many things in our lives, where a little bit of technology has made it just a little bit too complicated to get out of quickly. And so we've learned to just accept our failure and accept the punishment, whether it's money coming out of your bank account or politicians doing whatever the heck they want, regardless of whether it's good for the people. AI algorithms embedded in our devices make that worse, because the program can change instantly based on your behavior. So I'm not suggesting that AIs are about to take over the world. This is a screenshot from a video that was given to a television station in San Francisco last fall. I'm not going to say that money changed hands, but money changed hands, and driverless cars were allowed to operate as taxis in San Francisco at the end of last summer. And a whole bunch of things I'm not going to talk about on a recording happened as a result, and they're hilarious, and you can look them up. And a whole bunch of things happened that are horrible because the driverless cars were not ready to be driverless. This is hilarious only because I'm not the one taking the video, and neither are you. If this was happening below your apartment, it would not be hilarious. This is 4 a.m, and somebody has leaned out of their apartment to take this video. This is the parking lot for those driverless taxis. And at 4 a.m, they all go back home to park for the rest of the night and charge, because there won't be much business for them. And their proximity alarms go off because there are other cars too close to them. So all of those red and yellow lights you see, that's the proximity alarms of those cars flashing on and off while their horns honk and their emergency alerts go off because there are cars too close to them while they're trying to park in a parking lot beneath your flat at 4 a.m. Is that a problem with the AI? No, it's doing exactly what it's programmed to do. Car gets close, give off an alert. Car gets really close, give off more of an alert. But it should have been programmed not to do that in its own parking lot. And it hasn't been. So it's not that the AIs aren't clever. They're not. They're not clever. They can't think at all. I'd be happy to explain that to you during questions. But the people programming them leave out really basic fundamental things, and they don't want to fix it. They've learned that their work doesn't really reward them all the time, just like we all have. And so this went on for weeks, with people being woken up every morning at 4 o'clock because of cars honking when they shouldn't have been honking. This is a cartoon from my first book, and it's actually a conversation I overheard with somebody talking about a car accident they were in. It wasn't their fault. They just got a really shocking text. Don't use your phone when you're driving, not because it's the law that says you shouldn't, but because the part of your brain that is going to want to check your phone has more control of your body than the part of your brain that is trying to pay attention to the road. Please remember that. And the same is true if you're being interrupted not by a text, but by one of those onboard navigators screaming at you that you should turn in 260 meters, not 240 meters. And your uncertainty about it will cause cortisol to stream into your brain. And who knows what will happen. I do. I know what will happen because these devices are not our friends. They don't whisper wonderful things to help us live better lives. They scream at us all the time. They're screaming at you right now, and you're trying hard to ignore them, to pay attention to this lecture, but they're screaming at you even when they're silent. They're screaming at you as your brain shouts at you, "What are you missing? What are you missing?" I know that seems like a lot. Please remember, you may just be experiencing a period of illusory superiority. You may have false confidence about your ability to control your reflexes and your impulses when it comes to dealing with your phone. If there's even a slightest chance that you're not as capable as you think you are, please at least do some experiments at home to find out, for the sake of your children and your parents and your loved ones. Thank you very much.